So now this lecture is going to be on neuromorphic photosensing, right. So from electrical domain we will go into the light because natural intelligence and mostly human beings are all about vision. We are almost 70 to 80% visual because most of the information that we gather is through our eyes, right. So eyes play a very important role in who we are. So neuromorphic photosensing is a very vast area, and we are going to look into different applications of that. Now, photonic device, if I think about, right, there are generally 4 types of photonic devices which kind of operates on light or generate light. One is a photodetector, which is used for light detection. Then you have light emitting diodes, where you have input energy is electrical and then light comes out, right. That's like the LEDs. So, this is called the light generation. Then we have lasers, which are used for light amplification, and then you also have the solar cells, which are generally converting light energy into some electrical energy. So these are generally 4 types of photonic devices. We primarily work on photodetection, even to some extent light conversion. Laser and light emitting diodes we do not, but just for the sake of your knowledge, 2D materials are also being used to develop LEDs as well as lasers. But we are not going to cover that aspect because we are going to more go towards the neuromorphic application. And we know that the photodetectors, a good material would be a direct bandgap material, because there you will have the maximum efficiency of converting light into electrical energy, just because you don't need a change in the momentum when you absorb a photon, right. And the good part about the 2D material is that in the bulk they are not direct bandgap, they are mostly indirect bandgap in the bulk. But as you go to monolayer limit, along with the other advantages that we have seen, they also become direct bandgap, which means that they becomes naturally very good for photodetection, right. So you see, I mean, it's almost like 2 good qualities has been bestowed on MOS2, right, which is even not true for silicon, right. So this is a very interesting material system. Most of the 2D materials which are semiconducting actually becomes direct bandgap when you go to a monolayer limit. That's why they are kind of quite interesting for this photosensing application. Now I can combine light and electrical information in the same device. And also one thing also very important is that when light passes through a material, it absorbs the photons, right. And if the material is too thin, generally you will absorb so much amount of light, right, because the light will simply pass through. And as the material becomes thicker and thicker, you should be able to absorb more light, because until and unless you absorb a lot of light, you cannot convert it into electron hole pairs, right. So your quantum efficiency is going to go down. So ideally you generally need a very thick material in order to absorb light, right, because as I have a thicker and thicker material, more and more light gets absorbed, and I can use the maximum light energy and convert into electrical energy. So therefore, you will ask, why a monolayer, right. I mean, a monolayer can hardly absorb light, it's very small. But the interesting part is, if you look into this absorption coefficient as a function of wavelength, of course if the light energy is more than the bandgap, then you can absorb, right. But if it is less than the bandgap, you cannot absorb, right. That's the limitation. That's why there's a cutoff wavelength for the light that you can absorb using any material. And then there is this absorption coefficient, okay. Generally the absorption coefficients are of the order of you see 10 to the power 4, 10 to the power 5. This is a typical number per centimeter. That's the amount of percentage of light that you will absorb. Now if you do the math correctly, and if I use a 1 nanometer layer of MOS2, which is the thickness of a monolayer kind of, you will hardly absorb light, general, if it was a typical material. But the good thing about the 2D material is that their absorption coefficient is also 2 orders of magnitude higher than any known material. So just not their direct bandgap, they can also absorb more light in spite of being very thin. That's like another interesting property of 2D material, which makes them very unique compared to other bulk direct bandgap semiconductors, right. Make sense, this part? So you can I mean, I'm just trying to highlight why 2D materials for photosensing, right, because these are the important aspects, right. Now there are certain terms, again we may or may not discuss too much about it. Responsivity, which is literally how much current you generate in the device for a given input light energy. The ratio of that is generally called the responsivity. It's in amps per watt. Then the detectivity, right, which literally tells me okay, I can generate a photocurrent, but what is my dark current, without any light, what is the current that I am measuring, right? And you want to make sure that your dark current is as low as possible, which is kind of detected by detectivity, how well I can detect light, right? Responsivity is one, detectivity is the other, and then of course, the response speed, right? When I shine a light, how fast it goes up, and when I turn off the light, how fast it kind of comes down to its original state to speed. And then the dynamic range is, can I detect both low light as well as high light? You will be amazed to know our eyes are actually amazing in that manner, the dynamic range. So the dynamic range typically of a very good photodetector would be in the range of 40 to 60 dB. That means they can distinguish 3 to 4 orders of magnitude difference in the light intensity. But think about your eyes, right? We can actually look at and find out a star in a complete dark day, right, in a dark night, and we can also find when it's bright sunshine out there. And the difference in the intensity of a starlight coming to our eyes and a bright sun is almost 4 to 5 orders of magnitude or even more, and our eyes can do that, right? So eyes actually have an amazing dynamic range. Okay? And there are different cells in the eyes, cones and rods, we'll talk about that are actually good for low light and for high light. So it's kind of very nicely tuned. And the spectral range, what is the frequency range, right? And I mean, for example, we are visual, we only can look into the visual, the visible range, right? And if you want to use UV or IR, then you have to change the material and tune the band gap accordingly in order to have a better spectral range, right? So these are typically the parameters on which a photodetector would be benchmarked, right? And again, no photodetector will provide you all good quality, and based on the application, you will literally determine what you want to use, right? And you can see even within the 2D material family, right? MOS, let's say for example, graphene is actually very interesting. You see, it's broadband. That's another amazing property of graphene, because it does not have a band gap, and it's a direct cone. Every point is a direct band gap, right? So it can literally absorb light of any energy. Okay, so that makes graphene a broadband photodetector. Okay, your MOS2, WSE2, kind of fall over here. There are also other materials. You can also tune the material that you choose for the application range you're targeting. Right? Generally, IR detectors are very different compared to your UV detector and visible range detector. No single material can do it except for graphene. Again, one of the fascinating aspects about graphene. Okay, so that's like a typical overview of where this 2D material space falls into this this thingy. And then we know that photodiodes are mostly used for photodetection purposes, like a PN junction, because you have a reverse bias junction. Because generally, when you have the light falling on a device, you have to separate this electron and hole, right? If it's just a photodetector, you have to apply a bias, correct? But in a PN junction, you have a built-in potential, so you don't need to apply an external bias, and you can actually simply bias. If you want, you can bias it in the reverse direction, and you can actually create a photodetector using silicon, for example, or any 2D material. If you create a PN junction, then you can detect light in the reverse bias. And photodiodes are the most common commercially available devices for photodetection. I don't want to go into the detail of that, because you can really read any textbook. Photodiodes is not the topic of today's discussion. This is just showing how the photodiode works. And this is like a typical silicon photodiode. You can see commercially available. If you shine an LED, based on the LED light intensity, the photoresponse simply increases. This is all kind of known knowledge, right? You can simply buy it even in Amazon. I think the photodetector is extremely cheap. You know how much does this photodetector cost? 10 rupees is also expensive. I think it's like less than a few, maybe 10 paise or something. It's very cheap. Yeah, these photodetectors are extremely cheap nowadays. Okay, so I don't know, yeah, maybe 10 rupees actually. I'm talking about dollar actually. So then I think it makes sense. Yeah, you're right actually. 10 rupees is fine. 10 rupees is good. Yeah, it will be few cents literally. Yeah. Okay, so now what we are looking into is actually not a photodiode, but a phototransistor. Remember, all our discussion was transistor. Now I have this advantage that this monolayer is photoresponsive. So this transistor that we are using for logic, memory, let's see if we can also use it for photodetection. Right? Then I can combine functionalities in the single device. And you can see that if I shine the light, the response of the device in dark and in light are different, right. So now I have made really a phototransistor, right. And you can see that I can subtract the dark current, because even without the light I have an IV characteristic, and in light I have another IV characteristic. But now can you tell me, where should I bias this device as a good photodetector? Should I bias it in the on state of the device, or should I bias it in the off state of the device? Because remember, it is just not about the photo response, but also about the detectivity, right. I need to reduce my dark current, right, and my dark current is lower in the subthreshold or in the off state of the transistor, right. So ideally, if I want to use it as a photodetector, here I can tune the dark current, which I cannot do for a photodiode, because for a photodiode, whatever is the reverse bias p-n junction diode current, that is my constant dark current. In a transistor structure, I also have the knob of controlling the dark current, and therefore the responsivity and detectivity. So I can bias it at different regimes, as I will show you, for low light and for high light. When the light intensity is almost like your eyes adjusting to the brightness around you, right. That's the advantage of using a phototransistor, and you can subtract the photocurrent between the two. I mean, this is what is primarily happening. When you shine light in a direct band gap material, you create these photogenerated carriers, and because of the bias between source and drain, these photogenerated carriers go away and they get collected at the source and drain terminal, right. That's what is really happening. Some of these carriers actually also get trapped in charges, and that leads to a threshold voltage shift, which we will talk about later when we talk about the photo gating effect. Okay, but for the time being, we just the take home message from this slide is that our 2D transistor that we are talking about so far can also be used as a photodetector. Okay, and then it also depends upon the intensity of the light. Like a silicon photodiode, as I changed the light intensity, the response was different, the same as for this thing, right. So I did not lose anything, but I got an extra knob of controlling the photo response by biasing the device in different regime, because it's a 3-terminal device. In a 2-terminal device, I cannot do it. In a 3-terminal device, I have a 3rd terminal, which gives me this extra flexibility. Makes sense, right? This is photodetector 101. Okay, now limit of photodetection in MOS2 photodetectors. Okay, so this is where now we are going to go into neuromorphic aspects. So after some time, if the light intensity becomes very low, I should not be able to detect the light. That is the limit of photodetection using any device, right? If it's a bright light, so what I am doing over here, I am simply pulsing the light, okay, and I am pulsing it at a certain frequency. So when I measure the photocurrent response and take a fast Fourier transform, I will get the frequency at which the light is, giving me, the signal, right? And you can see that, I get that signal because the LED is kind of turning on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off at a certain frequency. If I measure the current response and look into the fast Fourier transform, there is a peak at the frequency at which the light is coming, right? So it kind of detects the frequency of the light information. Now, if I reduce the intensity of the light, right, you can see as the dimness of the light becomes, light becomes dimmer and dimmer. At some point, I lose that information. There is no peak, right? So here is a peak. That means I can detect that there is an information coming, right? But once it becomes still a peak, but there is no peak at that frequency at which the light is going. This peak is an artifact, but you see we have lost this peak. You see that, right? And this is the background noise, which is because of the dark current, or whatever is the background information is present, that gives me that noise flow, right? So here the point is that, okay, once the intensity of the light becomes too low, okay, I cannot detect it. That's very obvious, common sense, right? I mean, every device will have its detection limit, okay, and we established that the detection limit is such for my MOS2 transistor. But then you see my detection limit, when I'm in the on state, I can't even detect when the LED intensity is high. Why? Because the dark current flow is high. You see, the dark current flow is minus 140 dB, 160, minus 220. If the noise level is high, right, because of the dark current, and my information is below that, I should not be able to detect. So this is the advantage of the phototransistor. I can actually tune where I bias, and you see, if I bias it in the off state, I detect even up to 2.8 volt of LED voltage, which means that lower intensity of light, right? While higher intensity can't even be detected at a on state. So that is the advantage of phototransistor. Is this part clear so far? All good? Okay. Now the question is, okay, and then you can actually benchmark the performance of our photodiodes with a silicon photodetector. Okay, and here you see that the signal to noise ratio for silicon photodetectors could be higher, no problem. But when you look into the energy consumption, you see the 2D one, which is this plots, have a much lower energy consumption when they are biased in the off state versus silicon photodetector. Because our dark current is lower, we consume lower energy. Because at the end of the day, we are doing biomimicry. So if we replace silicon photodiode, we have to be better in order to energy efficiency. So 2D material based phototransistors gives me better energy efficiency even with the commercially available silicon photodiode, right? Because I have the third terminal which is not available for silicon photodiode, right? Makes sense? So more flexibility as well as lower power consumption, and that's the common theme for our entire discussion, right? We are trying to get to low power devices, right? This part is clear? Makes sense? Now I am going to go into biology. Okay, so we're going to talk about a very fascinating phenomena called stochastic resonance. Okay, noise enhanced detection of signal. Okay. Generally, noise is considered bad. We don't like noise. Right? Why? Because noise will suppress any information that is present. Right? If there is too much of noise, if somebody wants to talk to you, you will not be able to listen. Right? So noise is bad. Okay? This is our general consensus. That's why when we design our devices, right? So here you see, in a conventional approach, in order to detect a signal, either you increase the signal strength, right? Keeping the noise floor the same. You can see over here. So what is happening in this axis, I am increasing the signal strength. That's what was happening with our devices as well, right? As we go to brighter LEDs, we were actually able to get to higher peak values, right? So signal to noise ratio increases, right? That's one approach. Or you try to use and reduce your noise floor. You want to make a place more quiet if you want to listen to something. So if you reduce the noise floor, then also your signal to noise ratio increases. So ideally, what we use, electrical engineers always want to mitigate, or minimize the noise in the system so that we can discover signal, right? That's the general approach. But is that true in nature? Do you think that also, nature works like that? Because, a lot of animals live in environments which are very noisy, right? Even if we may have a lock-in amplifier, right, to reduce the noise floor. What about animals, living in very remote locations? Nature? Nature, you see that reducing noise is it's an information thing, but I'm saying that is it always true in nature? Okay, and this is what we use, all the instruments, low noise amplifiers, lock-in amplifiers, noise filters, just to get rid of the noise in the system, right? But if you are really trying to make a sensor which you are going to place in a jungle, right? Are you going to also put a lock-in amplifier with it, right? A lot of army people uses sensors which needs to detect information which are very tiny, right? That's why if you have a mine or something, it will explode. You really need to detect very small amount of signals. Are you also put that lock-in amplifier in his baggage so that it can reduce the noise, right? Probably not. And you will be amazed to know that there are many animals whose evolutionary success depends on using noise to detect signal, which goes completely counterintuitive to what we try to do. Let's see. So this is an example. Okay, this is an example. An experiment was done, almost 25 to 26 years back. It is published in Nature. So here is a paddlefish. Okay, and the paddlefish, stays in very muddy water. It is found in Yangtze River in China, and the river water is extremely muddy. So if it has to find another prey, and it feeds on these zooplankton called Daphnia. Okay, that's what it eats. Okay, to survive. Now the problem is, since the water is very muddy, the paddlefish can't see it. You see, right? So how do we find this Daphnia? Okay, you see that paddlefish has this very interesting organ called the electroreceptor. Okay, a very long tail, and it can detect electrical signals. We cannot detect electrical signals. The paddlefish can, because this Daphnia, when it moves, okay, it creates almost like tens of microvolts of periodic signals. Okay, because of this wing flap and the charges in the wing, it creates a very tiny signal, tens of microvolt. Okay, very difficult to detect. And this guy has developed this electrorostrum which can detect these tiny signals. In fact, sharks and eels are even better. They can even detect up to nanovolts of signal. Okay, how? Okay, now the next thing is, so that's all good. But then this Daphnia is underwater. There are a lot of things going on, right? So there's always noise. You're trying to detect such a tiny 10 microvolt in the presence of a noise, a Herculean task, right? So now there was another experiment that was done in the lab actually, where what they did is they kind of used this Daphnia, and then the intent, because in the lab environment there is no noise, right? So there's a paddlefish, there's a Daphnia, and then they intentionally added a little bit of noise, okay, to the signal of the Daphnia and see what the paddlefish does. What they found is, if they add no noise, let's say for example, the paddlefish can detect a Daphnia which is 50 meters away, okay, pretty far distance, 50 meters away because of the electroreceptor. If they add too much of noise, okay, then the paddlefish cannot find it, right? But if they add the right amount of noise, okay, then the paddlefish can find the Daphnia up to a distance of 75 to 100 meters. What does it mean? That adding a little bit of noise increase the detection limit of the paddlefish from 50 to 75, maybe a little bit, but that will give it a better chance of catching it and a better chance to be evolutionarily successful, right? So what was found is that in the lab environment, okay, noise helps in signal detection. Okay, the question is, in nature, where is this noise coming from? This is all arbitrary noise. Then the same group did another experiment, and then they found that the noise that a group of Daphnia makes, because these Daphnias always move together. Okay, so they're always making, everybody is kind of making noise. It's like mostly a noise, but then there is this one poor fellow which is a little bit behind the group, right? That generates a signal, and then the group of Daphnia creates the noise, which adds and makes the life of that poor fellow more difficult. That's why they call it, a noisy army betrays its outpost. You see, so there's an army personnel which is outpost, but because the army is making a noise, some enemy is able to find that person who is outside that group, right? This is how nature works, right? It makes the life of the paddlefish easier, but the life of the Daphnia miserable, right? But that is how the balance is kept, right? I mean, the preys and predators. But the take-home message from this is, noise can help in signal detection, right? Which is contrary to our belief that noise is always bad. Okay? So now let's see if we can use this principle and use it for our MOS2 photodetector and increase its detection limit, right? Then we have learned something from nature and have implemented it. Okay, and this phenomena is called stochastic resonance. So what is stochastic resonance? And it is found across nature. I mean, it is found in crayfish, it is a jewel beetle, and at all geological scales. In fact, the stochastic resonance was discovered from the periodic occurrence of ice age on this planet. Okay, that is also governed by the same principle, because of the fact that there is a certain tilt of the Earth axis. Okay, and there's a little bit of noise that happens when the Earth goes around the sun. Okay, and that small amount of noise gives you an ice age every 100,000 years. That's the periodicity that happens in the formation of ice age. Okay, it's a very deep mathematical model explaining that, but I'm saying that from the ice age formation, which is governed by stochastic resonance, to the evolution of many species and their survival, to even the opening and closing of ion channels in your neuron all have stochastic resonance. So at all scales, right? From scales molecular to geographical, right? Noise is being used by nature for signal detection. Okay? So the concept is very simple. Okay? Let's say you have a periodic signal, and if the periodic signal is below the detection limit, you can never detect it, right? Because it is below, right? But now you add some white noise. When you add that white noise into that signal below the detection limit, occasionally the signal crosses the threshold of detection, right? And then if you have a nonlinear device, a thresholding device, it can detect it, right? Because you have a periodic signal and noise. What is noise? Noise has all sorts of frequencies, right? It's a white noise. And that is why it is called stochastic resonance. Resonance is what? When frequencies match. So white noise has every frequency, and periodic signal has a given frequency. When they match, you get the signal detected. That is why it is called stochastic resonance. Okay? Now let's see if that can be done in our devices. Here's an experimental demonstration. Hopefully this runs actually, otherwise it will not be a good fun. Let's see. So here is an LED with a periodic signal which you cannot detect, very dim. You see there is no spike that is coming up. That means the signal cannot be detected. So we are doing real life experiment now. So very weak LED signal cannot be detected. That's just an artifact. No peaks come out. Expected, right? Because it is below the detection threshold of the photodetector. Now if I take just a random LED source, it's just randomly glowing, right? No signal, because there is no particular frequency, right? It is just random. So nothing happens, only the noise floor keeps increasing, right? So the signal which is very weak is not detectable, and if it is noise, there is no signal. What if I combine the two? That is the last experiment, right? So if I combine the two, now there is a periodic signal you will see in the background, the small one, and there is some noise. And you see the peaks get detected, right? So this is an experimental demonstration of stochastic resonance to enhance the detection limit of our photodetector, right? Inspired by nature. So what is really happening is kind of relatively simple, right? If your signal is below, and if you had no, it can never be detected because it never crosses the threshold, right? And then once you start adding a little bit of noise, it will start crossing the threshold, and I will start getting it detected, right? And if you have too much of noise, then again everything is lost because the floor is now much higher. That's what we just experienced, and this is a quintessential curve for stochastic resonance. No noise, signal cannot be detected. You see over here the signal to noise ratio is low. Too high noise, it cannot be detected. Only with a certain amount of noise I can detect it, and that is stochastic resonance. And it doesn't have to be, and you see the amount of energy that we are spending for this process, nanojoules, right? And this is what the basic philosophy of nature, ultra low power detection of signals which are ultra low intensity, right? So this is what we demonstrate in this work, and the SAR is generic. You can use it for not only light, you can use it for taste, for sound, for tactile sensation, anything, right? It is just a phenomena. It's just a principle that the nature kind of follows very meticulously, right? This is stochastic resonance. You see how we are doing. Okay, before I go into the next photo gating effect, this is about the photodetector. Any questions on this before I jump on to the next topic? Yeah. We may use it image processing. Yep. Absolutely. So we will have you show an example. This is not in today's lecture, where we actually use this, we call it stochastic computing. So there is a huge area in neuromorphic computing, a sub-branch of neuromorphic computing is stochastic computing. So we do that, and we show that stochastic computing is very important when you have information which are noisy, like image processing. Sometimes your medical images are full with a lot of noise, and we show that you can use those noisy images, use stochastic computing, and show that your inference accuracy increases even in the presence of noise. Okay, I will give you a demonstration of that, but not in today's lecture, tomorrow maybe, or day after tomorrow. So those are there already planned. These are normal conditions. These were not even vacuum, yeah. These were not vacuum. Any other questions? Okay. Should we go to the next topic? Okay, I can go. I mean, what about you guys have to tell me? Okay, good. Yeah, because there's so much to cover actually. We need to get to more. Okay, so we are now going to talk about photo gating effect. This is coming back to imaging. Okay, we'll go to the imaging part now. This is actually one of our papers which became the cover article of Nature Materials 2 years or 3 years back. So photo gating effect, there's a lot of information over here. So we learned about memory devices, right? What we learned about the memory devices is that by applying voltage, you are storing charge here, right? Correct? Now think about, instead of voltage, I could do it with light, because with the voltage I was enabling this carrier to tunnel from here to there, right? If I was able to generate carriers by shining light, I could also trap charges over here. Make sense? Right? So then I get something called the photo gating effect, because it is photo memory. It's almost like what we see, we remember. Right? So it is exactly the same principle. So don't go into all these band diagrams and stuff. This will take a long time for me to explain what's going on. But the basic idea is that what I could do with voltage to trap charges, I could also do by shining light. Right? But now this is non-volatile. So generally, what we saw in a response of a photodetector, once the light is switched off, the response goes down. Here, it doesn't happen like that. It stays, right? So you kind of integrate the memory automatically with vision, right, in these devices. By combining what? By combining a memory element with the photodetector. This is something we generally do not do, right? I mean, you may hardly combine a logic with memory, or memory devices are separate. You never combine a memory. Have you ever heard that a silicon photodiode has a memory? Right? Now we can do this with this 2D material, because we can engineer a photoactive material being gated by a flash kind of a memory device. So this is now getting more into it, right? I mean, we were talking about only logic, only memory. Now memory, logic, and light all working on the same device. Okay, and that gives me these different states. You see? Very similar to the memory devices that we spoke about, right? But now this is done through light, okay? And here are all the detectivity, responsivity numbers. That's all fine, okay? And we can actually detect the entire, visible spectrum: red, green, blue. So any LED you take and shine the light, you detect those light intensities using our photodetector, and they also create memory. Okay? And now we're going to see some application of that, okay? But this part is kind of clear, right? I mean, the spectral uniformity part, we don't need to go into too much of detail of that. A lot of other characterization where we simply show that by exposing, but this photodetector is also very unique, because if you expose this device longer to the light, you have more photogenerated carriers and more trapping, correct? So you can actually change the memory state by shining the light longer versus shorter. Make sense? That's literally how your vision also works. If you see something for longer versus shorter, that impacts your memory, right? So that's what we can do, and this is kind of a summary of that idea, right? And we kind of make this array of these photodetectors. You can see, I mean, because we are trying to make this pixel camera, so we are trying to really make a neuromorphic vision chip, and that's what that thing is. We have a lot of other circuits which will not go into the detail, but the idea is that we are trying to do something more neuromorphic, or what the eyes does using a chip like this. Okay, so we look into two kind of our work. Okay, one was published in SCSN and the other is advanced material. So bio-inspired low power 2D machine vision with adaptive machine learning and forgetting. Okay, too big of a name. But so what happens is, whenever you see something using your biological network, we just saw that picture of the biological network earlier today, right? So this is your eyes, and in the eyes there are like this special photoreceptor cells. These are called rods and cones. You can see over there, right? And one is for bright light and the other is for the low light condition. And what do? They convert the photons into electrical signals, right? So that's what it does. and then it kind of has this the ganglion cells, and that eventually converts it into the spikes. We told you, eventually it also has to be converted to spikes, and then the brain processes it. So that is the entire process of your visual system. So we have to create a similar system using our devices, right? So here we already have shown that our 2D transistor can respond to light and form this photo memory. Then we use a lot of circuits. We'll go into that in the detail to create those spikes, okay? And then eventually we kind of do learning and forgetting. That is what the brain is doing. Whenever brain is information processing, it is literally learning and forgetting, nothing more than that. Right? That forms a memory. So we're going to look into each of these aspects. Okay. So one thing first to notice is that as I increase the intensity of the light, the response changes. Higher intensity gives me higher conductance. No problem, right? Details are not important. I'm just giving you the gist of the matter, right? That is one thing. And the other thing is, as I keep the light shining on, as I was telling you, more and more charge gets trapped, and my conductance keeps changing gradually, right? So for each intensity of light, you can see that my conductance states change gradually. Low intensity, it changes from a lower value to a lower value, but if the light is very strong, then it kind of goes to a higher conductance state. But it's a continuous learning process. You see what I mean? This part is clear, right? And then once I remove the light, you see that it kind of maintains that conductance state, right? If it has seen a higher light intensity, it remembers that it was high intensity. If it was lower, it remembers this lower intensity. So this is literally combining the machine vision with machine learning. It has learned whether it was high intensity or low intensity. Makes sense from here? And now you see I show this image of this letter T, okay, to my device. So this is an light information. You can see the LED intensities, right? 0 and 20. 20 is the highest. So this is a letter T that I'm showing through the array of my devices. You saw that array that we have built. Let's see whether it can kind of if the video runs. Yeah. So as I keep shining the light, you see the conductance of this device array also now replicate the information it has seen, right? And then it remembers. So it is almost like my memory that forms, that I see T, I remember it's the letter T. Okay. The next thing is, it is very adaptive, right? So what happens, so don't go into those cars, I will show you some video over there. Now this letter T, you could read it under a dim light, right? Then it will be very dim in nature, right? Or you could read it under bright sunlight, then it will be very bright. So if you read it under bright sunlight, you don't have to focus too long to understand that is a T. But if you see something under a dim light, you will have to focus for a longer time, right, in order to know, oh, it's a T, right? So can I mimic this aspect in my device? And I can actually. So let me see if the video plays. You see, if the device is, you see it's barely T written over there, right? And what I'm showing over here is just by biasing the device in different states, as I was talking about in a transistor structure, I can actually learn the letter T faster even under dim light condition. Because here you see the contrast is very poor. The information that I am presenting has a very poor contrast, and yet I am able to learn just by changing the bias of the device. Is almost like the brain actually adapts. So if you come out of a movie theater, you will find that you cannot open your eyes completely initially, and it takes some time for you to adjust, right? This is very similar to that. Or if you go from a bright light and if you go to a dark room, you can't see anything for at least 10 minutes. And then your eyes adjust and you can start seeing things even in a dark room, right? That is the adaptability that we were able to show over here, okay? And then as I told you, right, so this is an analog learning. So if you have like, different intensity of light, you can also learn it in an analog manner, and you can also learn different colors. Right? This is red, this is green, this is blue. But here it will be always, grayscale, because brain is all about electrical signals. Electrical signals cannot be colorful, right? So color gets encoded into grayscale images inside the brain using conductance of the synapses. Right? So that's what we are able to mimic over here. And then as I told you that this device can also forget, because I can now apply that voltage to remove all those charges, right? And I could apply a small voltage or a large voltage. If I apply a small voltage, then you see the information that I learned, T, can either be forget immediately or it could forget gradually, right. So, I have now done gradual forgetting and fast forgetting. So, I can both learn and forget using this device. So, what is the advantage of this thing? The importance of forgetting has a lot of importance in noise resilient learning. So, let us say for example, if you have noise in the environment, let us say this example, this is, you see this letter T appears, but then there are also noise around it. You kind of learn it. You see, if you do not have forgetting, then you never learn that letter T. But if you are forgetting, then you learn the letter T, because what happens is the pixels which are randomly coming, that get depressed, that you forget, because it is not being reinforced. Because these are being reinforced, right? Every time these are always there. So you are seeing that information again and again and again, right? That's these gets really potentiated. But these pixels which are random, they are being potentiated, but you are also forgetting it. And that's why you can learn if forgetting is present, right, in a noisy environment. That's why forgetting is equally important, because we only talk about learning, but in a human life, forgetting is equally important, because forgetting allows you to learn better. Right? Makes sense? So that's what we are able to show over here. And then you can also relearn. Let's say, for example, you have a letter L shown, right? Then it learns the letter L, and then let's say the letter L changes to T. If there is no forgetting, you are messed up. But if there is forgetting, then you kind of forget L and learn T. Make sense? So combining learning and forgetting in a single device gives you these capabilities, and the device now become more similar to a photoreceptor cell or a neuron in the brain. Right? That's what we were asking about. Can we mimic using, somebody asked, right? Can we use a single device to mimic the brain functionality? So now you see that a single device is able to mimic an optical neuron. Right. That you can also, then you don't, then you have to allocate different memory for different learning. If your memory resource is limited, you want to kind of relearn. Right? If you have enormous amount of memory, then you can keep learning. Right? So that is one thing, right? Okay, then there is also spike-based computation, but maybe I will not go into the spike-based computation today. Let's stop here. Let's take some questions, and then we'll do the spike-based computation tomorrow, because that requires some background, and I will explain that, and then we'll go into that in tomorrow's lecture. So any questions on today's lecture? I mean this part. So ideally, the intensity of light will impact how fast you learn, right? If the light intensity is high, you will learn fast. It will go to a state, and then it will be non-volatile, right? Because of the fact that you're storing the charges, unless you intentionally remove them by applying an electrical voltage. Otherwise, they will go, but they will go very gradually, right? And these times are all kind of engineerable by engineering the material stack. Right? This is the aspect that we did not cover in the lecture. So if you kind of engineer the material stack, you can kind of find out how fast the photoresponse will be, how slow the decay will be. Right? So that is something you can control using these devices. Yeah. So more engineering knobs are there. Yes.
From my point of view, that I understand, there is output that is fixed. So how it can be unsupervised?
Oh. This is unsupervised, maybe not the best word to use over here. I agree with you. The reason we are saying it is unsupervised, because you see, in order for me to learn the letter L and then forget it and then relearn T, I did not do any supervision. I did not tell it that, oh, this is L, this is T, right? This is what we generally call supervised learning. It automatically changed as the information presented in front of the device changed. It automatically learned. I did not have to kind of classify that, oh, you're learning L now, you're learning T now. No, it was L initially, right? Remember, when we started this experiment, it was learning L first, right? And then when the T came, without any supervision, it stored T. Right? So in that context, we are calling it unsupervised learning. But you're also right that, I mean, unsupervised learning is a very bigger domain, right? But at a single device level, we are saying that we don't need a supervision to tell now learn L and now learn T. I simply keep showing it different letters and it kind of keeps learning that. Yeah, I was concluding it today because, you know, I think there's some part of this lecture still remaining, but I think it would be nicer to start tomorrow fresh because I think I've already bombarded them with a lot of information. More is coming in the next few lectures, so just wanted to make sure that, you know, they grasp the stuff that I spoke today. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, I think what I'm highlighting here is that without forgetting, you see, there is no forgetting. Hopefully, it shows up. Some loose connection is there. Because if there is no forgetting, you see, it's kind of a messed up image, right? So that's why, you know, the rate of forgetting is important. And then if you have no forgetting, then you cannot store the information in the same devices, right? And if you wanted to have too fast forgetting, then we don't even learn L. You see, so there has to be a balance between your learning and forgetting, right? So if your neurons never always forget, then you cannot learn, right? The forgetting rate cannot be faster than your learning rate, right? So your learning rate has to be higher, forgetting has to be slower. Now, how much slower, how much faster is all about each human brain and how they evolve, right? Some people can't remember things, right? I mean, Alzheimer is one of the things, you know, where you have lost your, you know, learning power. You are simply forgetting, right? So, and that is all related to the neurotransmitters. Certain neurotransmitters don't get released, and so therefore you do not form those connections anymore, but you're simply decaying it over the years. Yeah.